So welcome to this community conversation about decolonizing birth work. It is so important when we're talking about community bridge building, when we're talking about liberation work, abolition work, that we have spaces where we can talk with people who aren't just doing the work, but also are living the experience of the work as well. So I would like to introduce our two guests for this conversation, Taylor and Grandmaster Khye. If you all would like to introduce yourselves.
I guess I'll jump right in. Hi, my name is Taylor Rawls. I am, excuse me, a New Jersey native. I've been living in North Carolina for the past decade, 100 years it feels like. Um, and I am here tonight to share the story of my baby sister, Troi Foster.
Hi, everyone. My name is Khye Tyson. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the founder and creatrix of Kuluntu Reproductive Justice Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and where I focus on reducing the maternal mortality rate, specifically working with LGBTQ families of color and Black families who do not fall into the norm as far as family makeup.
And as we talk about decolonizing birth work and birth itself, really having a moment to even discuss what is decolonization, because so many of us, especially in this last year, have heard all these different terms popping up all over the place. And so making sure we're all right here on the same page when it comes to decolonizing. So as we know, colonization deals with not only the invasion and claiming of land from indigenous peoples, specifically in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, but it also deals with the invisible power of influencing and infecting and affecting how we move through these spaces. So our system of reality, our worldviews are influenced by those who are the colonizers, which in this case is white people. So when we talk about that, we're really talking about something that goes beyond just individuals. We're talking about a system, an ecosystem of white supremacy. And so as we're talking about birth work, keep in mind that it is in fact part of this ecosystem of white supremacy, which was not created for non-white existence. That is everyone who is Black, brown, beige, indigenous, exist in a space of queerness in LGBTQ spaces, and people who aren't considered part of the dominant group, which in this case is white, mostly heterosexual men. So basically everybody else gets the fuzzy end of the lollipop. But as we continue talking about this conversation, well, before we go into that conversation further, I would like to give Taylor a moment to talk about her sister, Troi, and her legacy and her family's journey through this ecosystem.
Thank you very much. Talking about Troi is one of my favorite things to do. So I'm glad to be here tonight to share her story and to honor her legacy. Honestly, when you on the flyer it says honor our ancestors, and the thought that my sister, who several years younger than me, is an ancestor now, it's a little mind blowing. But I'm going to get through this the best that I can. Um, Typically, I'm able to talk about her without getting too emotional, but I did type it out just in case. So, I'd like to start by sharing that on July 28th, my sister would have been 26 years old. We've lived in separate cities for most of our lives, and we had never celebrated our birthdays together as adults, but we never forgot one either. She was always one of the first people to text me or to call me and to say, Happy birthday, big sis. This year was the year that I started my first big girl job. You know, you get a nice little raise and you start to travel more. And this was the year that I was going to be there for my siblings. This was also the year that I realized I would not get too many more chances to do that, at least not for Troi. So my sister and I had many conversations, and there are a few I will never, ever, ever forget. And I want to tell you about these conversations My hope is that you'll understand just how much she meant to me and the strength of her character and just how large this hole where she stood is even now. Um, I don't remember the date, but the first conversation I want to tell you about is when she told me she was pregnant. And she said, I know daddy already told you. She went on to tell me that she was confused. She didn't know if she was ready. And honestly, she was considering abortion. But then she said to me in more or less words, I don't know what to do, but I know I have some changes to make. And I said to her, if you need me to fly in for an appointment, I'm there. And I'm here to help you heal. If you're keeping it, then I'm planning the baby shower. But because I knew my sister, the way that she spoke and the way that she addressed me and the way that she showed concern showed me that she was ready to walk into motherhood and really take on the challenge and succeed. And I told her that. I said, the way you speak to me tells me that I'm going to be an auntie. I want you to know that your baby is my baby, and it's always us versus them because we were truly a team. Flash forward, we are planning her baby shower because I said that I was going to plan it and I meant it. And she's the pain in my ass, essentially. I had so many conversations with her and I would say things like, I've got it. I've done this before, right? Just relax. And her response was always, I just don't want to look back and regret anything. I want what I want. And I asked her, I said, do you trust me? She said, of course, but I'm still going to voice my opinion in true Troi fashion. And so our final conversation, or our next to final, was heaven coordinated. I had flown into town with many plans, and I hadn't honestly planned on seeing my sister. I kind of did that often. I would just kind of breeze in over the weekend and breeze out. I had woken up and my original plans got canceled. So I had resolved to lay around and be lazy. And then all of a sudden, I had this urge to lay eyes on her. So I called and we made plans. We even picked up my younger brother, who is 19. And at the end of our trip, I said to her, I'm in a better spot and I want to be a better big sister. And so I told her, I said, I hope you all know, or I want you all to know, especially my brothers, because there's two after us, that you guys can call me for anything. Troi was always so nonchalant. Like she was just like, I know, sis, I know. And she kind of waved me off. We went back to her house and I said goodbye. I said, the next time I see you, you'll be a mommy. And she said, I know, right? Because it was truly that crazy. I rubbed her belly and I said to my nephew at the time in utero, I'm so excited to meet you. And then I told her that I loved her. And she said she loved me too. On April 29th, my father texted me at exactly 11:23 p.m. and told me that they were inducing labor for my sister. So, as concerned big sisters do, I made a call. It was early AM, late night. And she told me she was being induced because she had high blood pressure. She said she was ready to be not pregnant and that she was tired. I told her that it would be over soon and that I would try to give her time to get settled before I came to meet the baby with her nephews. She told me she was about to get a shot. She was scared to death of needles. So she would call me back once she calmed herself. I told her that I loved her and that she was going to do great. That was the last time that I spoke to her. And she was so looking forward to becoming a mom. I know that she would have proudly raised that baby. I have had so many conversations after that one in which I've learned to adjust from past tense to present tense, or from present tense to past tense, where I've talked about no longer what we will do, but what we should have done. Not what she can do, but what we can do in her stead. We've talked about how her baby will be raised or how she would have wanted him to be raised. And none of those conversations make more sense to me at all than what I could have said to my sister 1,000 times over. Her legacy is one that embodies love and joy. She was literally a light to all she met. And I am just so, I don't know, honored, blessed, grateful. There's not a word that describes it strongly enough that I was chosen to be her big sister. And not a day goes by that I don't think about her or that I don't try to honor her in some way. So thank you for letting me share her with you.
And thank you so much, Taylor, for sharing your sister's legacy. And right now, how old is your nephew?
He just made 3 months. So we went up last month, my dad and my brothers and I, we got everybody together. We honored her legacy by attending a family event. Her cousin, who is my nephew's godmother, has a yearly event to honor her mother who passed around the same time earlier, of course. And it's called Khye Day. So it's like a big celebration of all the ones that we've lost in our family. It's my sister now, her uncle, her aunt, her grandmother. We honor them all at one time. It was an amazing circle of just love and warmth. So we went up there. We celebrated that. Nephew turned 3 months, so we celebrated that. We honored her legacy by taking family photos, which we had never done with my dad and his children. So it was a beautiful weekend. Thank you for asking. He's a big boy now.
And for those of you who are listening in, if you would like to support Taylor's nephew, the young Carter, there is a GoFundMe page that is still active called College for Carter. And you can go to GoFundMe, type that in, and support Carter as he continues his mother's legacy as right now an infant, but one day a young scholar and one day a young adult who will go on and carry his mother's voice and her will in his spirit as she goes on to the realm of ancestors. So thank you for sharing this space with us tonight, Taylor.
You're welcome.
And Grandmaster Khye, as we take in this story and also think about how there are so many stories like Taylor's sister, when we think about how this tradition of Black people being in hospital spaces and them not coming out. How is it that we, and you specifically as a birth worker, process that story? And how is it that you as a birth worker use your platform and your voice to challenge those systems that were not created for us to be safe and in many cases exist?
Yeah, absolutely. First, Taylor, thank you for sharing your sister's story. She sounds like she was a beautiful, beautiful person. And I feel like I'm holding this story and I'm breathing through it. I think for a lot of Black folks, especially if your ancestors were brought over to this country and enslaved, I hate to say that we're almost used to the trauma. We're almost used to the pain. And I don't want that for us. I want us to heal. I want us to heal. And for me, as a birth worker, as much as I harp on adequately naming the harms that are done to us, as important as that is, it's even more important for us to heal. Because the one thing our ancestors have been resisting since the first day they laid their pasty feet on our continent. And one of the ways that we resist is to keep our joy, is to keep our, to keep raising our kids, right? To keep pouring into each other and loving on each other and cooking for each other and all those things. And so I just, even more than I want us to name the harms that are done to us, I just want us to heal. And I want us to learn how to heal and to learn how to move through grief and all the messiness, all the messy things that life is, and all the messy things that white supremacy has created for our lives in particular, for us to heal and to hold each other through that. And Taylor, it sounds like your family is at least trying to, is putting forth an effort to really hold each other through that. And I really want to honor that, because that healing is just as important as justice. It's just as important as us, as folks doing right by us. And so that's, as a birth worker, to answer your question, Sydney, I see it as my role to remind us that we know how to heal and that we instinctually do a lot of that, right? We feed each other. Like, that's the first thing. Black folks, we will feed you. You hungry, baby? All right, come on. Like, because we know that is healing. Even if we don't know it, right? Even if we don't cognitively know it, we know it. And we know how to heal. And it's just about creating that space for us to heal. And that's what I really work towards, is making sure that, like, we know that we already know what we need. We already have each other. We already have our community. We just have to pour into each other, and we really need to, yes, absolutely fight for justice, and we need to heal through this, because that was the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Like, that's one of the main critiques, is that all these people were burnt out. They were not taking care of themselves. They were not healing. And that was not a sustainable movement. If we are going to sustainably fight for our rights or sustainably fight for our liberation, we must do so while simultaneously healing.
Absolutely. And I know when we talk about birth work, when I first started seeing all of these different folks over on Instagram and on Twitter who were saying they were Black doulas and Black birth workers, the first thing I remember thinking was, we have those? I mean, we might have one or two, but this is a whole community of folks. And when I started talking to other Black and brown folks about it, one of the things that their response was, wait, we have that? Isn't that a white people thing? Isn't that something that our, like, great grannies might have done? People are still doing that. And I'm curious why you think there's this slight disconnect when it comes to this natural space of birth work, something that is so essential in a lot of Black communities and Black spaces. Why is there this, not just this disconnect of information, but also why is it that there's this perception around birth work that it's something that maybe white hippies did in the 70s during that summer of love?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So there is, well, much like everything else, it's directly related to racism and white supremacy, of course. So I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago with another Black woman, and she was saying, like, slavery, we lost all of our birthing rituals and traditions. And I was like, oh, no. Let me not correct you. Let me lovingly share our history with you. So midwives they exist all over the world. They have existed all over the world since the beginning of time, since we've been making babies, right? And various cultures, whether it's indigenous folks in North America, South America, India, Asia, Africa, all over the place, have indigenous birthing practices. And Black midwives were some of the millions of people stolen from the continent. And Black midwives were very important on plantations and plantation life and during slavery, because I believe it was like 1806 or 1807, there was a law passed that said basically that no more people could be imported and brought into slavery, which meant that slavery could only exist as far as Black women's wombs or Black people's wombs were, pumping out babies. And so during slavery time, there were doctors, but the white doctor was only called in drastic circumstances. The white doctors were expensive, and for the most part, white doctors would not treat Black people. So we had our own folk medicine folks. We had herbalists. We had all types of folks who, whether they were working with the elements to heal us. And a lot of that knowledge got passed down, and a lot of that knowledge also got lost, of course. But, Black midwives were very crucial to making sure that babies were being delivered in a relatively healthy manner, knowing that our ancestors were being starved and overworked and all those things, right? So midwifery was a thing Black midwifery was common until the 1940s, 1950s. And really what happened is the medical industrial complex determined that they wanted to make money off of Black families. So they created targeted campaigns. The US Department of Health created targeted campaigns to convince the public that are Black midwives. So in the past, they've been called granny midwives. Are Black midwives now, they prefer grand midwives, but that the granny midwives of the day were savages, that they were unhygienic, that they weren't washing their hands, and that their presence in folks' births meant that people's babies were dying and that they would be harmed. So there was a very targeted, directed campaign against Black midwives. In addition, while that was happening, the smear campaign, there were all these regulations, as soon as, like, that's always the main thing that happens when they start to move the goalposts, is regulations start to come out the woodwork, right? So all these Black midwives who maybe have been practicing for decades now, before medical school and all that, it was really apprenticeships. So if your auntie was the midwife on the plantation and you were maybe 10 years old and you really love playing with the babies, auntie might say, okay, baby, I'm going to start, you can be my helper, you can be my apprentice. And eventually I'm going to start to show you the ropes and you're going to be the next generation's midwife, right? That's how that happened. Well, now all of a sudden the United States is saying, well, you need to go to nursing school. Well, hey, there's segregation and a lot of Black people are really poor. So how you expect me to go to nursing school? Or I have to go to these trainings that, now, if you think about Black folks in the South, especially in the deep South, like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, there were still dirt roads. People were out in really remote areas. So it's not always easy, even if the training is accessible, even if the training is free, it might be an hour away, on dirt roads. And Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, literally, maybe I'll get to this training, so it just barrier upon barrier upon barrier to the point that eventually Black midwives were a rare breed. And there are some lay midwives now, but there are, in a variety of states, it's illegal for midwives to perform home births, literally illegal. If they have certification, they can get their certification taken away. Some midwives have been arrested or convicted of crimes in different cases. And so it's literally criminal for us to practice our indigenous midwifery practices. So yeah, they do all that, right? They get rid of the Black midwives for the most part. And then a couple decades later, because white supremacy has a short memory, they repackage it into, hey, if you're a new revolutionary woman of the 70s and you want to have control over your birth instead of being knocked out with drugs to the point that they have to tie your body down because you're convulsing from the drugs that they're giving you. This is called twilight sleep, and that was happening in like the 50s, 60s ish. And so, yeah, the next generation of empowered white women decided that they wanted to take back their births. And then all of a sudden they were getting doulas and midwives. But of course, midwives still then and to this day, they have to have a nursing degree. So, that's why there are so many more white midwives, because white people have more access to higher education, to the money to be able to pay for higher education, all of that. So very long story to say that they took our practices away from us and then they repackaged them. And, much like yoga and a lot of things that they've taken from a lot of cultures, they package it up and they convince you that it's the new hipster thing to do when we've been doing these things for hundreds of years.
Can I also tag in here? I think that there's also a cultural piece to it, because when we, like, growing up, right, your mom didn't say, hey, Khye, you should go be a doula. We push the careers that have been pushed to us. We say, oh, you should be a lawyer, or you should be a doctor, or you should be a football player, or, let's have hoop dreams and go to the NBA. I feel like there's a lack of education around this as well. Even when I talk, I'm excited, right? So I'm telling my husband, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to talk about Troi. We're going to be online with like birth workers. He's like, birth workers. I was like, doulas? Not do they exist? What are those? So like, not only do we need to say, this is ours, give it back. Like, we need people to join in and advocate for this as a career choice, just as those
Absolutely.
aunties did. When you see that little girl or that little boy, or they, them, whoever, when you see those people interacting with children, and you say, instead of saying it's weird for a person your age to be this interested in children, say, hey, why don't you consider this as a career? It opens up a different path. And it's, no one has opened up that path. And so, to your point, that propaganda succeeded in all the right households. Because
Correct.
we're no longer interested in getting nursing degrees and learning our indigenous practices, because we've been told that there is no money, there's no fame, there's no fortune to be found there. And that's simply not true.
Yeah. And there's I would say, as far as like the doula world, I feel like that has become more and more talked about maybe over the past 10 years or so. But before that, doulas weren't like this is kind of the current iteration of birth helper, but doulas aren't necessarily like historical. I think some people like to like kind of lean on that, like, oh yeah, doulas have been around for X amount of time. Like, realistically, especially for Black folks, the doula, quote unquote, was your sister, your cousin, your auntie, your mother-in-law. Like, the doula was someone who was close to you, but maybe not your mother, maybe not your grandmother, not the midwife, but someone who was close to you and who was there looking out for you. So, doula, like, yeah, that current iteration, and it's not necessarily something that you can go to college and major in, right? So it's not something that people necessarily know about. And like, and I think part of the cultural piece is that people just don't take birth seriously. Like, in our society, they're just like, oh yeah, people have babies all the time, whatever. And, you don't think too much beyond it unless you are about to have a kid, or, you're someone close to you.
And even then, you don't go in thinking, I may not come out of this. Like I said, I've given birth twice.
Yeah.
Twice. My boys are 6 and 3. So, like, not even like, decades ago, I gave birth twice within like the past 10 years. And so when you go in, I know from experience, I'm like, the doctor's done this hundreds of times. It's fine. She'll do what needs to be done. Mind you, with my first son, I was damn near unconscious by the time he finally slid out. I pushed for an hour and some change without any assistance or intervention from my OBGYN, and it's like, that's 15 minutes of time that I'll never get back, where I was like blacked out. My mom is like, you don't remember? I came around, I held you up, we pushed. I don't remember any of that. And so you start to take these experiences and you're like, oh, they're just normal. That happens to everyone when they go give birth. Everyone pushes for an hour. Everyone blacks out. Everyone, loses oxygen and has to wear masks in between pushing. And everyone has to be induced for every pregnancy. And like, you just don't think like these things, these medications, these processes, these practices are going to lead to me never being able to lay eyes on my children.
Yeah.
You don't go in thinking that. And so there's definitely a cloud of like, oh, no big deal.
Yeah. And that's something that I'm curious about, is like, how do we get Black folks to, and not just people who give birth, right? Their partners, their siblings, like their families, it's everybody. Because if someone dies or if someone is harmed, it doesn't just affect them, it affects the entire family. So how do we have conversations to get Black folks to understand, like, look, this is life or death for all of us at this point. It's life or death for all of us. So there's a piece of like, and I kind of blame like American sex ed for this, but like, nobody knows what happens during labor and delivery and pregnancy. And we all just kind of assume like, yeah, your belly gets big, but like, okay, also your bones become like gelatinous. Also, like, your feet are swollen. Also, all these things, there's acid reflux and all these different, that we don't necessarily.
Your spine literally shifts in your body. I remember being in middle school and they showed us a picture of like the skeleton of someone who was pregnant. And I just remember thinking that people have to be superheroes, I think, to have babies, because I was like, how is it that your spine knows to shift to offset that baby? And I'm like, what is happening?
Yeah, and just I think like the middle school health class, like some of the stuff that they do is like fear tactics. Like I remember we watched like a video of someone giving birth with like no context. It was just like, here's this video of someone giving birth, and okay, it's just really weird. Or like, here's all the STIs that you could catch and die from. Like, it's just sex ed in the United States is trash. And so like I don't know. I think we, like you said, Taylor, we like underestimate like, oh, these doctors have done this. They know, they know what they're doing and they're going to have my best interest at heart. First off, that's a deadly assumption to make as a Black person.
Right.
Deadly assumption. In any situation, honestly, like even with our elders, especially, like you cannot take, I hate to say this, but you can't take your doctor's word as bond. Like, be willing to get a second opinion, be willing to fire your doctor, be willing to tell your doctor, hey, this is a boundary that I have, or this is something that I need from you. And I think, I don't know what it is. Like, I've heard it like white coat syndrome of like, oh, assuming that this person is a doctor. So they have this expertise or they're smarter than you or whatever, but no, like, you know your body best, you know your family best. And like, as Black folks, we need to acknowledge, we need to know and take back our power. Like because a lot of us just walk into this space like, oh yeah, whatever the doctor says is fine. No, that's not okay. You can't, whatever the doctor says, these people do not have your best interests at heart. And I'm trying not to snap, but they do not. They have the hospital's best interests at heart. They have their career at heart, their malpractice suits at heart. Like, even the things, and like, it's a system. Like we were talking about this before, but it's all a system. So even if this one individual doctor is great, the things that they learned in medical school are racially biased. So of course, how they're going to treat you is going to be racially biased, period. And if we know that walking in, then we can at least armor ourselves and we can prepare ourselves and be willing to say, look, if this doctor is talking reckless, I can go to another one. I can switch providers. I don't care if I'm 36 weeks, I will switch providers. Or if us being willing to also say, you know what, I'm not going to give birth in a hospital. I just saw a thing on Instagram the other day, and it was an op-ed on, I don't remember the website, maybe on like Blavity, and it said why I feel safer giving birth in my car than a hospital. Speak on it. Because they're not going to listen until all of a sudden, how come no Black people are giving birth in a hospital? Like, that's what happens every other time. They don't listen to anything else except either riots or us taking our money elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think you spoke on something that's so important to just how just because you're wearing a white coat doesn't mean that you are the authority on this. I know there's a series right now called Dr. Death, which is about a neurosurgeon who was in Texas, and there were over like 30 people who had either died or been like permanently injured because this man had no business doing surgery. Apparently he was brilliant when it came to research, but he said, I want to be a surgeon because I think I'm entitled to that. And people were finding their parents when they had to get a disc taken out or something, he removed entire parts of their spine. So his best friend, he ended up paralyzing and has to move his wheelchair around with his chin. But just the audacity of this man to say, well, I'm a doctor, I have my career, I have this legacy. And my brother, who just finished medical school, one thing he always says is there's no one that has a bigger ego than a doctor. Like, the fact that if you question them, he said, he said, you'll be hard pressed to find a doctor who will find a way to not be condescending when you ask a question and say, well, I heard this or I heard that. It's like, okay, well, I have this fancy degree. You see all these degrees on the wall, so you tell me this. And it's like, well, I'm not going to tell you that because we're dealing with me. We're dealing with my body, and I'm going to tell you something. And I love how you had said earlier too, that you can fire your doctor. Like, that's something my eyebrows went up thinking, wait, that's a thing? We can ask for somebody else to come in?
Listen, you pay them. If my mechanic is not fixing my car, guess what? What's the difference? They're a service provider, period. They are not God. They are not almighty anything. They are humans and they are fallible and they can get fired. Like if I could impart any piece of wisdom on all Black people, I think it would just be fire your doctor, or at least know that you can. Like
That's the caption.
That's it.
I was laughing because as Khye talked about, like how, you know, doctors don't know it all and white coat syndrome. And it's so funny because I tease my mom all the time. I'm like, she would tell me things like opposite of what the doctor would say. And I'd be like, the doctor said, and she'd be like, the doctors don't know anything. And I'm like, you've never gone to school. What do you mean the doctors don't know anything? But again, that's the attitude that propaganda has put into Black households. It's like, the doctor knows everything. You know nothing. Your grandmother's way is not the best way. Your mom's way is not the best way. Your baby should sleep between these hours. And if it doesn't, it's going to ruin your life. Or, you know what I mean? Or it's not going to develop naturally. And there's all types of like small little like indoctrinations. And now I'm like, listen, these kids stay up as late as they want to. They get up when they want to. We eat whenever they're hungry. Like, and they tell you like, oh, like, it's like literally, and this is off topic, but that birth to prison pipeline.
That's not off topic. Talk about it.
Because it's regimented from the day they're born. They're like, you're going to eat between these hours and this hours. You're going to do this every 2 hours. You're going to take a nap from 2 to 3. You're going to wake up and you're going to play. Then you're going to read. Then you're going to, it's from birth. Birth. These milestones have to be hit by this age and they have to be doing this and this and this, or your child is like lacking in development. It's insane how it all connects and yet nobody connects it.
Yes, exactly that. I just saw again on Instagram, because I be learning on Instagram, like
Instagram is educational, period.
Right. So somebody did some, it was a white woman actually, she did some research and she was like, where did the 3 square meals come from? So of course, much like everything else, it came from racism. So the white people showed up on this land and they saw indigenous folks. I don't remember which tribe, but they saw indigenous folks basically eating when they were hungry, like eating, you know, intuitively. And of course, the white people were like, oh, look at these savages doing this savage thing. We need to teach them how to eat 3 meals a day by killing them and giving them smallpox. But like this whole, it's just so many things that we think are like normal and natural and human are just white people thinking, like they want us to think it's normal and natural and human because they want us to buy into their supremacy. But like you said, you know, yeah, if your baby doesn't sleep between this hour and there's something wrong. Look, is the kid getting his 10 hours or his 12 hours or whatever, you know, age group he needs? Then what's the problem if those are during the day or at night? Like, I mean, if that's how you want to live your life, go ahead, you know, go off. But like, it's not inherently wrong to do something on a different schedule. And how many of these things that have been taught to us that are best practices or normal or natural for people are biased and are either don't take us into consideration or don't take us into consideration. That's really it. Because like I think about like puberty and like Black child development. And like, I know that it's not necessarily universal, but I know a lot of Black kids are, you know, we'll say they're big for their age, quote unquote, like according to whatever the chart is, right? You know, the chart, oh, a 7-year-old should be this tall with and this much height or this much weight. But, you know, when I was 7, I was probably close to 5 feet already. So like, we are different and that's okay. Like biologically, so many things are similar. And then culturally, I don't know whether it's like lifestyle or food or if it's, I don't know, some other biological thing that I don't know, but like we are different in certain ways. And that has to be acknowledged and it has to be respected. And like our cultures, instead of trying to retrofit this white culture to us, just leave us alone and let us reclaim our indigenous practices and the practices that our ancestors that you told us were wrong and backwards and demonic and whatever else. Just let us reclaim that, because that takes us into incorporation. And so like Taylor, you were talking about like the, you know, the womb to prison pipeline. Yeah, it starts immediately and it's also part of that is like, if you, like you said, like if they don't meet these certain milestones or timelines or whatever, then they're seen as like not being developmentally on track or whatever. And the next piece of that is a lot of these doctors and teachers are very phone happy to call child protective services on Black families, which is also an act of genocide. We were talking about genocide before, like an act of genocide, including straight up killing us, is also putting us into ghettos. It's also taking our children away from us. It's also making it so that we're afraid to have children. All those things are genocide. And so they'll be quick, oh, well, your baby is X amount of months and you're not feeding them this particular way that we think you should feed them. Sorry if my dog is barking, if you can hear that. But you're not.
Your dog wants social justice as well.
I know, he mad. He's so mad. But instead of maybe baby's first food, in a lot of Black cultures is like plantains or yams or sweet potatoes. And like, if, oh, well, they need to be eating X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, these are our cultural foods. Yeah. And yeah, so
exactly. It's just. And you touched on something that was so important too, just that fear that comes with birth. And I know, especially in my generation, so many of us are talking across gender lines about not having children, in part because now all this information is coming out about, oh, well, the United States, as far as developed countries, has the highest maternity mortality rates. And amongst those groups, it's indigenous women and Black women who have the highest mortality numbers. And this idea that we're not safe, therefore we're going to go and just not have children, which of course, if that's what you want to do because you're like, I want to travel, I want to do this, I ain't the nurturing type, I'm not about that, that's fine. But the fear of having children. And so, a lot of my friends, we talk about, oh, well, let's think about foster care or adoption. And again, the barrier of white supremacy strikes again, because the things you have to do to be able to adopt children, and the fact that there's all these white folks who have Black children who, when you talk to them about what you found in your research, oh, I have to do this, I have to prove my credit score is good, all these different things. And they're like, what? I didn't have to do that. And it's like,
I bet you didn't.
Exactly. And so, even when we talk about, oh, well, let's reclaim another space, like there are Black children out there who need families, who need homes, who need love and nurturing, let's help those children. We can't even do that. So it's like we're literally facing all of these different inequities in all these different spaces, and they're all connected to each other. Just like you said, Taylor, that birth to prison pipeline is a very long pipeline that has all these different parts sticking out. And we just have to find ways to navigate, and in some cases, probably get the axe and literally chop the pipeline up if we're able to get some muscle work in there. But definitely, it's just a whole process of like finding all of these different areas where we have to face these barriers and realizing that all of the different people in these different spaces of liberation, we have to find a way to communicate with each other and be like, hey, those of you talking about push out of kids in school, of you talking about mass incarceration, those of you birth workers doing your birth work thing, we all have to find a way to get to the same spot and be like, hey, how do we build this community back up? Because again, it is from birth to our transition that we have to face these inequities, that we have to face these systems that were not created for us to exist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's why I appreciate reproductive justice, because as a framework, it encompasses so many of those: prison reform and education and environmental racism and housing and all these different things. And yeah, like you were saying, Sydney, how do we build that community? How do we interact with each other when all of us are doing this work and attacking it from different angles? And that's the question, right? Like, how do we go about doing that? And that's kind of where I'm always thinking about, like, okay, how can we connect these two issues or connect these 5 issues, because they are all connected, because they're all happening to us. So yeah, how do we go about doing that? And how can we put these resources behind all these different things, kind of having this multi-pronged approach? I'm not sure.
Well, and I think, well, I know there's a quote I want to read from this little book I've been reading called Decolonization and Afrofeminism, which is peak, everything, everything about it. But the author wrote a bit about what she calls reconstructed culture. So when y'all were talking about the propaganda work, that all of these lies that have been fed to us, fed to our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, all of them have stuck with us. Because sometimes I sit there and think, you know, Black folks, whether we're on the continent or whether we in the Americas or in Europe, we are some of the most advent supporters of white supremacy when it comes to changing aspects of our culture, disaligning ourselves with whiteness. So we might say racism is a terrible thing, but we will be hard pressed to give up our day-to-day practices and our policies if it inconveniences us. So when I tell people, oh, you know, if it's about like reclaiming your Black dollars and investing in Black businesses, the immediate thing that I'll hear from Black folks is, oh, well, it's not a nice building, or, oh, they're not really professional. They don't have good customer service, like all these things that, you know, the white person last summer was just coming in there and saying, how much stuff can I buy and get to my car? But we're the ones that say, it doesn't look nice. It doesn't give me this sense of, oh, everything's put together. But this author, she wrote, quote, bolstered by religion, law, education, and reconstructed cultures, colonization not only reinvented notions of men and women in Africa, but also the way that they related to each other. Under this new logic, colonized women were either diminished or erased from important areas of social and public life. Indigenous sex and gender systems were altered, and their conceptualization of sexualities refocused through the lenses of excess, immorality, and negativity. Social patterns were disrupted, and Africa's understanding of society was invaded by Europe in its entirety. Like all of that, our whole idea about the fact that we had fluid ideas about gender, about sexuality, about how we lived our life, how we connected with people in our communities. And all of that was ripped away. So even the idea when people, especially in Black spaces, we talk about birth work, we talk about sexuality, we talk about gender, we talk about womanhood, masculinity, feminine, all of these different things. A lot of times the pushback that I see manifesting is through this white lens. And so telling people that this idea that you're touting, whether it is you think it's from a religious place or a spiritual place, is actually codified by whiteness. Our spirituality was not white oriented historically. Our ancestry has nothing to do with whiteness. And all of our lived experiences are part of this ancestral tradition. It's like, how do we get back to that? And how do we disalign ourselves with whiteness? And I think in this case, a lot of it is starting back at the root or at the womb and talking about reproductive justice and liberation work through birth work, because so much of that is about getting back to our foundation, even for those of us who don't have kids, because goodness knows, a lot of my friends will say, you're really interested in birth work. Do you want to be a nurse, or do you want to have a lot of kids? And I'm like, why do I have to want a whole like forest of children to be invested in this work? I'm like, I am invested in the children that are here, the grown-up children, and the children that are yet to come.
Right?
Yes,
As we all
same.
should be, because how do we continue as a culture, as a community, as a country, if there are no children, if there are no Black children, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And so that's important. And it's like when we talk about community, like, or even you say, like, you know, they took it from top to bottom. How do we get back to, like, you have to be a brave soul, right, to reclaim those, like, because in my house, you you don't believe in Jesus? What? Like, you know what I mean? Like, as a Black child, there are certain things that you just, certain cultural things you don't get to take apart. You know what I mean? You don't get to be spiritual. You get to be Christian. You know what I mean? You don't get to be, you know, they, them. You get to be she, her, he, him. You know what I mean? So when we talk about, Khye talked about having that fear, like that fear pushed into us and like placed down deep within of like even giving birth and outside of hospitals and things like that. Like you have to be brave. You have, and even down to the fact that being taught like there's going to be a lot of pain associated with this. You know, you're not going to want to feel that. You're not going to want to go through that the way that your ancestors went through it with no medication and no assistance and no assistance. So it's like your fear comes from like, well, I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to be outcast. I'm going to be ostracized. I'm going to be left alone. I'm not going to have like if they mess up, I'm not going to be covered for anything, you know, like if something's wrong with my baby because of this, I'm not going to be able to get her or him or them the assistance they need. And those are real fears. Like you could not pay me to have another baby right now. I feel like, and it's almost like you shouldn't be a survivor of birth, right? I'm a survivor of birth, whether I like it or not. And it's like I survived the first 2 times. I ain't testing fate. You know what I mean? Like I won't do it again. I won't at home in the hospital. Like and that's because I've had this experience where I'm like, oh wait, like you said, not taking it seriously. You go in and it actually happens, and you're like, holy shit, people still die from this millennia later. We haven't figured this out yet. That mothers and babies should be simultaneously able to go home. Like that's the basic. That's step one. We haven't even figured out like how can we get to prison reform? How can we get to police reform if we can't even figure out how to get babies here alive, to get parents here alive? You can't talk to me about anything else until you get step one figured out.
Absolutely. I've said that before, like alive should not be our metric for whether or not a birth was successful, right? Like, okay, both of them are alive. Cool. Like, no,
Not cool.
no. And we don't even, with the maternal mortality rate too, we don't even talk about the trauma of people. You know how many Black people I've heard say, I almost died, I could have died, I've never once heard a Black person who gave birth in this country say, you know, I had a really great experience giving birth. I've never heard a Black person say that. Like, and when that actually hits me, I'm like, wow, that's really messed up. Like, that's really messed up. So like how much, even if we are alive, if alive is the only thing we're measuring, then we're missing the trauma, which means that we're not healing, which means that it's a whole bunch of people who gave birth, even if you gave birth 15, 20 years ago. I had a conversation with a woman, this was a white woman too, and she gave birth in the 70s and she had a traumatic experience. And she said it came back just like that when we had our conversation. Like, traumatic birth isn't just something that goes away. Like trauma, we know that trauma doesn't go away, especially traumatic birth. And Taylor, you were saying like people, it's so normalized, like, oh yeah, everyone needs to be induced, or everyone has, you know, high blood pressure, everyone needs this, that, and this. No, that's not normal. That's not preferable. It's not healthy. It's not. And that's like, I still kind of blame middle school health class. Like, we don't know what a normal, natural, physiological birth looks like without any interventions. If you talk to you walk up to 10 random people, you know, at the store, you know, not in COVID, but like in theory, you walk up to 10 random people and you say, what's your idea of birth? It's laying on your back in a hospital bed and pushing. That's not the best. That's not even in the top 3 best ways to birth. Like, that's not a good way to birth. So why is that our cultural perception of birth, and that it's going to be painful and that you're going to be screaming and just like, that's not, birth doesn't have to look like that. And, you know, if that's what our picture of birth is, no wonder people are terrified of it. No wonder.
And I remember when I was in Ghana doing some work, there was a woman in the village who went into labor. So they took her to the little clinic. And so all of the medical students who were there were in the clinic, and they were talking about how these women from the community all came into the room. So it was a very crowded room, but all of them were there like chanting with her, praying, singing, and then the baby came. And then the doctors cleared them out a little bit, but then the mother was ready to go home, even though she was still a little oof. Like all these women came and walked with her back to the home. And so then all the other people in the community like were coming out and singing and dancing. And it was like this whole community experience. Now, granted, in the United States, us Black folks are a little spread out from each other. So we all can't come whenever there's a new birth, but even just that idea that like you don't have to be in the room by yourself, or it doesn't just have to be your immediate family. Everybody, the auntie's best friend, that one lady who works down the street, all of them coming in and supporting you through that process. And some of the fathers too, because the father was there, his father was there, all of these, both in masculine and feminine spaces, that this is a collective experience and we are celebrating that there's a new life in our community. And I think for so many Black folks, I know that it's this whole ordeal. Like even if, as we're happy with our baby showers and we're happy with our family spaces, we also have in the back of our head, okay, here we go. As soon as we're going into that hospital, and like that fear and insecurity, especially if you're in a white dominated space of being afraid to ask questions, or if they tell you you don't need medicine, or oh, that everything's fine. Again, that dangerous assumption that they know what they're talking about. And we hear stories, even Serena Williams, who literally had to show them and say, I have a pre-existing condition, I need you to check for this. And if they hadn't checked, how she wouldn't be with us here today. And I know even with my own mother, I have multiple surgeries outside of birth, that if my father wasn't a nuclear pharmacist and could say, have you given her this? Have you checked for this? If he wasn't able to get in the room and advocate for her, what that could have been. And, again, the fact that we shouldn't even have to be in that situation. And again, how is it that we nurture our birth workers, but also our herbalists and our healers in our community as well? Because again, it's not just about going to the doctor when we have a cold, but also reaching out to the elders in our community, to those who are well-versed in these traditions, and asking questions to them. And of course, being able to gauge the elders and folks in the community that are aligned with whiteness, and the ones who, in fact, know what they're talking about. The ones who can talk about the herbalism, who can talk about the practices. Because again, it's not just about giving birth, it's also post-birth as well. I think that that's one thing that so many people I know who've had children in my age bracket, all of them say, the ones who haven't who haven't utilized birth workers or doulas, all of them talk about how they didn't know that they were going to have to go through all of these postpartum situations. They didn't know what postpartum depression was. They didn't know how all of these different issues could manifest. And I know that's actually one of the questions that one of our listeners is asking, is how is it that birth workers deal with postpartum care? And how is it that, let me make sure I'm asking the question the right way. How is it that birth workers can teach people, both those who are expecting children and thinking of having children, about that postpartum process?
Yeah, so birth workers so there are a couple different ways, I guess. One is that there are doulas called postpartum doulas. And what postpartum doulas usually do is we will come to your home after you've had your baby, and we will focus on the person who just gave birth. So usually what happens, like, I feel like it's like a running joke with like moms, I guess, or maybe a joke on moms, that like, oh, once you have the baby, it's not about you anymore. Like, first off, that is false. Like, that's the biggest thing for me as a birth worker that I want to impart, is that. Like it is about you, and you still have to put yourself first, because if you don't, you're going to resent your kids. You are going to have mental health issues. You have to put on your mask before you can put on anybody else's. And it's unfortunate that I think a lot of our parents and a lot of previous generations, they had so much anger and resentment because white supremacy took away their ability to take care of themselves. Whether we were 6 months or 6 years or 16, like a lot of our parents worked too many jobs to be able to take care of ourselves, or were caretaking for multiple people's children, or for multiple family members, and weren't able to take care of themselves. So I think sometimes we have this idea that like we can do it ourselves postpartum, or that even we can raise a baby ourselves, not necessarily like single parent, but even like if you're a 2-parent household, like, oh yeah, we can raise our baby ourselves. And like, yes, of course, you have everything you need to be a great parent, and you need other people to be a great parent. You're gonna need breaks. You're gonna need someone to pick up and fill in the gaps that you can't. And so those postpartum doulas can help with laundry. They can help with, I'm gonna hold your baby while you take a shower and take a nap. Or, I'm gonna help you figure out what are different ways you can ask your family members or the people in your community to help you. And that's a lot of the education, is like working with the families one-on-one to say like, what would be helpful for you during your postpartum time? What kind of food do you eat, so that we can get this meal train going, and people can drop off food at the house? What are some chores that you can delegate to different people? That the doula is really working with each family to think through, who is your community, and how can you ask for support and get what you need so that you can be the best parent that you can be, especially during those first few months postpartum. And I've heard from other I feel like there's a birth worker that I learned from. I want to say it's Corinne. Ooh, I can't remember. I think her last name is Partera, but I think she said like postpartum, after you have a baby, you're postpartum for the rest of your life. Like it's not just 6 weeks. It's not just a couple of months. You're postpartum for the rest of your life. And like how can we as a community support people who are going through this huge transition in their life? You're not just, you're not getting your appendix taken out. You're not graduating from 5th grade. You're having a baby. Like that's going to change you. I don't care if it's your first baby or your 9th baby, you're going to be a different person on the other side of that. And as a community, it's our job to support you in that, and to hold you in that, because there's going to be a lot of changes and a lot of things that are getting upended. A lot of people like move houses when they're pregnant, and in preparation for the new baby. A lot of people will get new jobs and all these different things, right? They're like trying to level up their lives to anticipate for this baby. Well, you need your community to help you, and that's the main thing. Like, we need community, and that's another thing that white supremacy took away from us, that community. I say that community is the opposite of capitalism, because capitalism wants us all to be separate. Capitalism wants us to buy a new stroller every single time we have a baby, instead of passing it down from our big cousin. And, I don't know if anybody else's family, you get a giant trash bag full of onesies when you're pregnant. Like, I don't know if anybody else's family do that, but my family do that. And that's what white supremacy doesn't want, right? They want you to buy a new crib and buy all these things, and to constantly be in this state of lack. But if you have a community that's strong and robust, like ideally you should never go hungry, right? Your needs should be met. If we are, what's the word? If we are emotionally intelligent enough to communicate our needs, and to communicate our boundaries, and to communicate, when we have conflicts and all those things, like that's how we build healthy communities, and that's how we get our needs met. And like, it's not far-fetched for us to have our needs met. It's not like, we all deserve to have our needs met. And that's not, and for us to think, oh, well, we're burdening them, or like this person doesn't want to help me or whatever, like, no, that's false. And like, that's the purpose of community, is for us to hold each other in those transitions and in those times when there's a lot going on, good, bad, or otherwise. And that's the work that we need to do with, we're talking about decolonizing and like getting back to the old ways. Those are the old ways. And we need to be willing to let go of this white supremacy, bootstrap, individualist mentality and be willing to be vulnerable with each other and to hold each other through these crucial times.
I know there was another question about what are some of the best ways to secure doula or midwife services or to start research?
Yeah, for sure. So there are a few different directories out there to find a birth worker. One of them, there's like the National Black Doula Alliance, I believe. But they have a directory, or National Black Doula Association, sorry. They have a directory. Sister Midwife Productions has a directory. It's SISTA Midwife Productions. And that's who I did my doula training with. And she has a directory of doulas who are trained under her programs. I know there are other Black doula directories out there that I'm sure if you Google Black doula directory, so many things would come up. And I will say that, like you said, Sydney, a lot of us are spread out. So if you're in a space where there maybe aren't a lot of Black people, and maybe you can't find a Black doula in your area, if you're open to it, be willing to look for a virtual doula or someone who can meet with you online so that you can still have support from a Black person who understands Black issues, but you're not necessarily having to travel super far or anything like that. So I hope that helps. But yeah, there are multiple directories out there. There's so many Black doulas, and if you're on Instagram, and I'm sure if you look for, or if you search for hashtag Black doula, so many of us will pop up. We out there, there's plenty of us.
And the last question is actually for both of you. So as we've been talking about birth work and how it intersects at all of these different types of reproductive justice, restorative justice, liberation work, abolition work, the question is, how do you think that birth work can impact not just Black communities, but communities that are marginalized across the board?
I think that when we speak about birth work, right, I think that very term like Black doula, a Black midwife, it starts, as all things start, with inclusivity, right? Because we've been so pushed outside of our community that we are placing our trust in the hands of people who are not for us. And I think inclusivity and trust and community are lessons that we could learn across the board. When we talk about LGBTQ and non-binary and spiritual versus religion, all of those things can be true and exist at the same time without conflict. The only thing that makes it a conflict is white supremacy. That's hate to buzzword, right? But it's been coming up a lot. And I think that, like you said, the opposite of capitalism is community. And so when we speak about like buy Black or Black owned businesses, that's another community that we've drawn in, because we take our money and we donate it, we give it to midwives, we give it to doulas, we give it to our community to go and support their children as the postpartum, like you said, we're postpartum forever. So we give our money to those communities, those of our sisters, our cousins, our brothers, husbands, fathers, to go and support their community. And then it becomes something that's so much more than birth work. And I tell people all the time, could you imagine what kind of life you would have had if your community would have come together the way that it was supposed to, right? And so birth work is not just birth work, it is life work. You're bringing a life, and the way that life starts, it has to be within a community of people who are willing to support that life for the rest of its life. And so it is all connected. Now we have to do the work to actually connect it.
Yes, thank you for that, Taylor. Yeah, it's absolutely life work, and it's absolutely like the things that I've learned in birth work, like they are applicable to so many things, because like I talk about this all the time. Like when we talk about the things that are good for babies, those are usually things that are good for humans in general. Like they're like, oh, skin to skin contact. Like humans need touch.
Preach, give me a hug.
Like humans need, right? Like what's the study that says like if you hug somebody for 20 seconds, like your oxytocin goes up? We need skin to skin contact. Like these things are, oh, you know, you need all these things for your baby in the first whatever for development. I need these things at 31 and I'm a big baby. So like we need these things at 62. Guess what? If you don't have a community, you're likely to die younger. So what does that say for our elders that are isolated? So yes, this is not just birth work, it's life work, because it's so much more than just this one particular part of life, because it's so expansive, and it's so like, if we're rethinking birth, then let's also, you know, while we're here, we're already rethinking birth. Let's rethink how we're raising our children. Let's rethink how we're feeding our children, right? We've seen breastfeeding come back to prominence in the past probably 10 years with doula work also. Like it all kind of goes in together. Like, okay, if I'm thinking about breastfeeding, well, then that means I need to think about the foods that I'm eating, because the foods that I'm eating are going to affect my body as I'm breastfeeding, right? It's not just the baby, it's the whole, it ends up affecting the whole family. Because if I'm cooking broccoli, then we all eating broccoli. So like if I'm going to the farmer's market, then I can bring my older kids to the farmer's market, and we're learning about farming and where our food comes from, and we are connecting back to the land. It's all connected. It's all like, it's just, it's, if we are going back to our indigenous ways and our ancestral ways in birth, then it begs the question, where else can we go back to those ways? And what other parts of our lives can we decolonize?
I'm just over here writing all these notes from both of you guys. But wow, that is so important, I think. How we were able to come into this space, not only share our testimonies, but also heal together and also celebrate together. Because even as we mourn, even as we heal, we also celebrate, and we also find ways to engage. Through our trauma and our anger, we utilize, which I tell people, the difference between Black folks who are angry and white folks who are angry is that white folks go and start an insurrection at the Capitol for pointless stuff, and Black folks collectively start organizing in their communities. So very different wavelengths of how do you utilize anger and rage.
Say that. And, you know, like you were saying with, you know, as we mourn and as we grieve, we also celebrate. And ancestrally, very like deep down, we all know that it's the same, right? Like good and bad, they're two sides of the same coin. We grieve and we celebrate. If someone passes away, we grieve their transition, but we celebrate that transition because they're an ancestor. So right. As Black folks, ancestrally, I heard this a long time ago, like, you know, in some African cultures, like the place that you praise God and the place that you party are the same place, because it's all, we acknowledge that everything is connected. Everything is connected. And this white supremacy, it silos so many things out and it separates so many things. But I think for so many of us, the reason why we can get hype at church the same way we get hype at the club is because we know it's the same energy, right? We know it's the same. If we're celebrating life, there's also a piece of mourning. There's always those two things, and that balance, I think we know, even if we don't intellectually know and we don't intellectually, you know, pass that down to our kids. I think the way that we live our lives says that we know that the good and the bad are always going to be right there next to each other, and we're gonna celebrate, and we're gonna mourn, and we're gonna live through that, and we're going to do that together.
And I know that there's one scholar who always says, oh, Black people got to where we are today without any help. And while there is truth in that as well, I like to add, we helped each other. The reason that we're all here today is because our ancestors carried on and carried each other. You know, you think about how our ancestors who were on the boats, our ancestors who were on plantations and small farms and attics and basements, who had to deal with the long civil rights movement, which is still going on, fighting for the same things that my great-grandmother had to fight back in the 1920s and 30s, having to realize that we're all collectively carrying on this legacy. We're all a part of this greater story. And I think even as we mourn, like you said, we also celebrate because the energy is the same. Even when we're angry, even when we're seeking justice, like the work that we do, people might say, wow, why are Black people so angry? Why are they shouting? I was like, my voice is loud to show the level of my love. Like I'm shouting with love. My anger is fueled by love. It's not fueled by hatred or fear. It's fueled by, I am tired of this and I love my people and I love the people around me, even those who might be a little aligned with whiteness, but we're gonna get them there because we're gonna carry on and we're going to carry each other. But also, I need my break. And also, I need to protect my space. So even as we're fighting, being able to say, I need my space, I'm not going to get involved with this. I need to take time for myself to mourn, to reflect, to heal. That is liberation work as well. And I think as we come to a close, that's such a great message to end on, is that rest. Because this ecosystem was not created for Black folks to rest. It was not created for us to have any time to ourselves, to have any space to thrive, to nurture ourselves and our communities and our families. And so I think as we come to a close, just reminding everybody as well, if you would like to support Taylor's family and Taylor's sister Troi's son, you can find them on GoFundMe at College for Carter. And Grandmaster Khye, do you have anywhere that people can go and drop you some doula love and doula donations?
Yes, if you feel blessed with an abundance of coins and you would like to share, my wallet is open. So Kuluntu, we have two different ways you can donate. One, you can donate via PayPal. Our link is paypal.me/KuluntuRJC. And then we also have a monthly recurring donation page where you can sign up, and you can sign up for as little as $3 a month. And you can support Kuluntu RJC and all the work that we do. And it comes out the first day of the month, kind of like Patreon or something similar to that, where it's like a monthly thing. So you can either donate one time or monthly. And I dropped the link. I shared the link with Sydney. So yeah, y'all can definitely go and support either one of those ways.
And Grandmaster Taylor, if your wallet is opened as well, is there a way that people can send you some love and warmth financially?
Listen, I need nothing. I dropped the link to the college fund. I am honestly just blessed beyond measure to be able to see and care for my nephew. So yeah, focus on him.
Mm. And again, thank you so much for sharing your sister's story and your nephew's story as well. And know that we are all here in this virtual community and in real life as well. Well, we are in real life, but in the physical world as well. You have a community here who is lifting you and your family and little Carter up as well.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for tuning in to this Decolonizing Birthwork community conversation, and go in peace, as we say.
Bye.
Bye.